that I think these two guys are pilots. They both love their flying. Just a little anecdote, Lisa and I spent a bit of time down at Tokemwald last season, and every day Ingo was out there, and I say every day, during the week and weekends, out there flying, sometimes when others weren't flying, because he loves his flying. And I can see the same thing with Brad. He really enjoys his flying. I've had a number of talks from Brad, and you can see the passion coming through. So I think that's what really makes these guys valuable in this sort of situation. It's about the flying for them and the passion that comes with that flying and enjoyment they both get out of it. So I think that's really of some value today, and I think that's why this is going to work really well. So without further ado, I'll just hand over to these guys. Thank
you. Yeah, we've attempted to I guess give you a bit of a overview on how we approached our trying to win competitions in the past, and Ingo and I are going to talk on various subjects separately, but what I'd like to relay is probably the things that I thought were most significant in my performance or my achievements, and Ingo is very much a part of that, and for probably many of us competition gliding pilots, where Ingo set such a high standard and was, at the time when I was learning how to fly competitions, very much in awe of what he was achieving, and I very much looked to Ingo in how to do it, and watched him very carefully, and Ingo and others before him as well, but more Ingo in my case than anyone else. And I'd really like to relate to you probably, I think, what I still think is one of the most significant changes, or one of the most significant turning points in my gliding, was a week back in 1980 where some of us here maybe went to it, Terry Cubley and a couple of others, I can't remember all the names, Norm Block, and we're fortunate enough to be invited to a week at Tokemwald to do some flying with Ingo and to improve our competition flying. I still really relate that as a very good thing that I did, and it changed the way that I flew very much after that. And it was Ingo's approach, even though it wasn't quite, I wasn't quite aware of what was happening to start with. I'm a bit of a slow learner, but after I went home and thought about what we'd done and what we'd been looking at, I really did then start to understand a bit more about how Ingo approached his flying, and we came up. The most significant thing is what we have up there back there is with a priority list, and I think that's very, very important. And I'd like to see at the end of this as to whether we think that's changed much now either. But we produced a list of, it's not up there, but anyway, thanks Pete. Not being technically minded, Peter, could you help us out here? But at the beginning of the week that we went with Ingo, we pretty well started off with just writing up what we thought was a list of the most important things that we needed to do when we were cross-country flying, and what they were that which was the most important and how significant they were. And I think they started off being in the order about how they're written, and then at the end of the week we wrote down the modified version of what was most important. Be interesting to see now, 30 years later, as to whether we think those priorities are the same. But given lack of time, we all work, or most of us are working, that sort of thing, I found it was very important to prioritise what I was doing when I was going flying, and concentrate on the things that we thought most important. And as you can see there, we concluded at the end of that week that our meteorological navigation was the most important thing to give us the best result in the competition. And then, in order to achieve that, we spent the week looking at thermal structures, what thermals did, how we should fly in and out of turn points, and what direction we should fly when we're low, and how we should navigate through the air to achieve the best result, or fly in the best air at all, the most time we could. And that was a lot of fun. We did all sorts of things, like Ingo spent a lot of time putting up on the board the structure of thermals in various wind conditions, so that we could actually improve our mental picture of what was actually going on in the air. And I think that's been the most significant point for me after that day or that week, to me achieving what I've done. I certainly started concentrating more on trying to picture what was happening in. Always it's been a struggle, you're scratching your head and saying what the hell's going on today. But by methodically thinking about it and looking at the structures and the models, you can, over a long period of time or quite a bit of flying, you can develop a better picture of what's going on, and that then significantly enhances your performance or your result. I don't know, Ingo's going to talk about the thermals. I want to talk a little bit about some other points that we did. In looking at thermals and how they affect, where we did a lot of work on, or little bit of practical demonstration on whether we should fly into a turn point high or low, and the difference between the thermal strengths, what they were, comparison, the equally comparable thermal between when we flew in and when we flew out. These numbers that we came back with Ingo had produced were really quite significant. It was a comparison, like if the wind was about 30 or 40 kilometres an hour, that we should be using a 3 metre thermal in comparison to a 1 metre thermal or a half metre thermal once we go around the turn point. I had never actually really thought too much about these things, and Ingo, during this week, definitely showed us how important particular things were, and we came with a much better picture. So if you'd like to look at those priorities, and if you want to ask any questions about them later and see whether we think we've changed them in the meantime, we could change them for today, or to what we do today.
Can we get the picture of the thermal structure, a cross-section of the thermal? Well, when you look at this picture, you can see that the thermals are essentially vertical, and in the center you have the core of the thermal going up, right up to the inversion level, and there the thermal will hit the inversion like a water hose you splash against the ceiling of the room, and it divides in all directions and curls over like in a vortex, and presses down on the slow climbing part of the thermal, not the core. The outside part of the thermal is slow rising, and you see the curl over is stopping the slow rising air from reaching the inversion. Only the core reaches the inversion and spreads out at the inversion in all directions. And therefore, at that level, below the inversion, you have an outflow of the thermal in all directions, and low down, the suction of the thermal would normally create a vacuum, but it can't happen. So the air flows in to the thermal from all directions. So at ground level, you have an inflow of air. At the inversion level, you have an outflow of air. And with modern instruments, you can see the direction of the wind vector and can navigate into the thermal by following the wind directions according to the height you are flying. At low level, you want to fly with the tailwind into the thermal. At high altitude, near the inversion, you want to fly against the wind to find the thermal. And outside the thermal, you have downdraft, all the way down, almost to the ground, and the downdraft will spread out over the ground in all directions. That is about a picture of a cross-section which a university group in Germany have established by flying with motor gliders in different altitudes simultaneously through a thermal and recording all the rate of climbs, moisture content of the air, and temperature. And interesting to know that the temperature difference at ground level was quite significant. That's why the thermal kicked off in the first place. But very soon after, at the mid-level of the thermal, mid-altitude, you have almost the same temperature inside the thermal as outside, but the thermal keeps going up under its own momentum. It has a lot of weight moving up. It's a lot of inertia, keeping the thermal in its movement to the inversion. And at the inversion level, you even have a reversal. Sometimes it's a bit cooler in the thermal than outside the thermal. That's what they measured with the cross-section flights with motor gliders at various levels. That gives you a bit of a picture of the cross-section. When the thermals are initiated of a very intense heat source, like stubble fire or a power station, then the thermals are aligned downwind from this heat source like a thermal stream. We call it a thermal stream. Several thermals close to each other and with a sink in between. When you fly along in a glider, such a thermal stream, you can maintain your height or even gain some height by slowing down in the thermal and fly faster through the sink. It's not a cloud street or a thermal street. It's a stream of thermals. Cloud streets occur when you have a certain meteorological condition with a wind profile which increases with height up to inversion level and then decreases again. That's why what they found over flat terrain, even over oceans, that thermals will create cloud streets. And sometimes they go up in bubbles, not in continuous streams, just like bubbles, disorganized and turbulent. So lots of funny things happen for thermals going up to the inversion. Sometimes they bend up, like we see with dust devils. They are not always straight, not always a straight column of rising air. Sometimes they bend one way or the other, but soon they become vertical again. They always have the tendency to the vertical direction. They move with the wind, and at that week in Tokyo we made an experiment. We placed one glider inside the thermal and two gliders outside in the environmental air, also thermaling. Of course, they were going down, but this glider in the thermal was not drifting downwind as fast as the other outside gliders. That means that when the wind has a wind profile which is increasing in strength with height, then the thermals drift downwind with the speed of the lower wind, where they originate from. And then the outside air, the environmental air must blow around the thermal. And the wind outside the thermal is stronger than inside the thermal. The thermal usually drifts with the speed of the lower wind. That means when you have thermal conditions in a ground jet, sometimes the wind is strong near the ground. You have a wind profile strong near the ground and easing off with height. Then the thermal will drift faster than the environmental air. Thermals can rotate as much to the left as to the right, or not at all. Most times they go up as a vertical column and they don't rotate. So if they do rotate, and they rotate fast, like in a whirly, it's best to a thermal against the rotation, because then you can climb better. The wind shear effect on thermals can create waves on top of the convective layer, and these wave formations can influence the thermal strength, because in the wave crest, where the wave goes up, in the wave crest the thermals are enhanced in strength and in height, whereas in the trough of the wave, the thermals are depressed and are not as strong, or sometimes it's difficult to work them. They are broken. They become more like a rotor in mountain waves. These waves we find in thermal conditions can also be likened with mountain waves, because the thermals with the cumulus cloud on top is the obstacle. The upper airflow has to blow over the top and form this wave conditions. And these wave troughs really make the flying cross-country difficult. And if you can experience such difficulties, you can say that, or you can expect, there must be waves up top. Rotors are a dead giveaway for wave conditions on top. I think it was 1968, John Moore, Ken Sowden, and myself, we wrote an article for AG, and we described in this article these shear waves, as we called them. Helmut Reichmann later on in his book Cross-Country Soaring, I think it's called, Cross-Country Soaring by Helmut Reichmann. He also describes the same waves, and he calls them thermal waves. Of course, thermals create these waves. They are the obstacles, like mountains. But not every thermal day you have shear waves. We call them shear waves because the wind shear is the factor you must have for creating those waves. All right, we played around with it for many years now. So in Tocumwal, which has a very flat countryside, there's no hill inside, we fly in those waves maybe twice a week. It happens quite often. And on the best day, we had a narrowmine one day. I think the waves went to 20,000 feet. Who can remember the day of narrowmine with the shear waves? Chris? Yeah. And that day was remarkable because the thermals, they stopped at the cloud base, of course, with, I think they were 4 to 5 knots, the thermals. And the wave strength above the cloud base, the wave strength was 5 meters, 10 knots. And in no time we went up to 20,000 feet. It was a very strong wave conditions without mountains. The mountains were just cumulus clouds with the thermals below. And just to give you an idea of how solid these thermals to 6,000 feet are, a column of rising air with certain diameter will be as heavy as 80,000 tons. 80,000 tons, it's as heavy as a oil tanker in the ocean. And that presents quite an obstacle for the upper airflow, and the upper airflow gets organized in a wave condition, wave action. Talking about thermal sources, some thermal sources produce the thermals on a regular basis. You can maybe in a certain time interval find a thermal over a good thermal source all afternoon. And some sources produce thermals later in the day, usually in the undulating countryside or mountainous countryside where the western sun heats up rocky faces. Rocks heat up very well and produce thermals late in the day when they face the western sun. Well, that's as much as I can say about the thermal structure. Now we talk about the feel of the air, yeah?